Good afternoon. My name's Dr. Aidan Rhodes, and I'm the Energy Policy Briefing Papers Fellow here at Energy Futures Lab, and also one of the co-authors of today's paper. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of our new briefing paper, which is Delivering the Future Power System. For those of you joining us for the first time, just a quick introduction to the Energy Futures Lab. We're one of 7 global institutes here at Imperial College London. We established in 2005 to address the world's major energy challenges by bringing together teams from a variety of research backgrounds to carry out both multidisciplinary and high impact research. So as you know, the UK remains one of the few countries with emissions targets in line with the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. That has been slipping a bit recently. A core part of our emissions reduction roadmap has been the decarbonisation of the electricity power systems. And this paper is basically designed to provide an in-depth, rigorous and comprehensive assessment of our progress towards meeting this goal by 2035. So in a moment, the lead author of the paper, Ali Erzels, will join us and he will take us through its key messages and our conclusions. And this will then be followed by remarks from our invited panelists, who you're going to meet in a few minutes. We're then going to move to a Q&A session for the panelists and the presenters for the final about half an hour or so of this event. You will be able to submit questions through the Q&A feature in Teams, which is on the top sort of middle right of the Teams box. Please submit your questions during the presentation and the panel discussions. We'll be able to address a handful of questions, so please have a look there for interesting questions that you would like to see answered as well, even if you haven't submitted them, and you will be able to rank them up by putting a little thumbs up signal next to them. So finally, this event is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. So we'd encourage you to share that recording with colleagues who won't be able to make it here this afternoon. The briefing paper itself will be also available for the Energy Futures website, and you'll find a link in the Q&A. So now to introduce the paper and give you the presentation, I will hand you over to Ali.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. I'm Ali Erzels, and I'll be spending the next 10 or 15 minutes or so to take you through some of the findings coming out of our research on delivering the UK's decarbonised future power system. As Aidan mentioned, we'll be following this up with a panel discussion and Q&A. But before that, let's get to it. Some 5 key takeaways that I'd love to leave you with today coming out of this research. First is that power system decarbonisation and electrification, and doing those rapidly, is a fundamental driver of meeting our net zero ambitions. There has been a gap in the research to date in providing a holistic framework that defines what actually needs to be delivered to achieve that goal. To introduce you to the framework, the landscape that we've come up with to fill that gap, to highlight 6 segments within this framework in particular that we think require the most significant policy attention, and without which the 2035 target will be difficult to meet, and take you through 10 of the key recommendations coming out of this research to address these 6 segments to accelerate delivery. First, where does power system decarbonisation fit within the overall UK targets? So the UK has a target to meet net zero CO2 equivalent emissions by 2050, but in line with the CCC's recommendation in their 6th carbon budget, we want to decarbonise the power system by 2035, which means we want to have a net zero carbon power system 15 years before we meet net zero. And the reason for that is a decarbonised power system and electrification is a foundation to delivering a net zero economy. The approaches for analysing how we do that to date have been primarily through doing theoretical pathways of how it could be done and the assessments of various trade-offs of what we need to do in order to be able to deliver it. There's also been a number of assessments. I've tabled a couple of them on the right-hand side. There's been many, many more that look at various aspects of how delivery has gone to date. And you'll see a lot of these are quite recent and a lot of work has gone into this space. But none of them have actually kind of stepped back and said, what does it really mean to do this? And what are the various components that need to be delivered? And then systematically gone through to assess how we progressed within those segments. So our aim was to fulfill this gap and to, one, define it, and second, to assess these various segments. So how do we go about this? Recognizing the wealth of information and work that's already been done in this space, we use what's called a grounded theory approach to assess the work that's already been completed, and then triangulated our findings through industry events and expert interviews. So the first phase of our research involved a systematic review and codification of existing publicly facing material that's been published to date. We used that to build a draft framework and assessment, and then socialized that with a number of experts within the space and did semi-structured interviews to take in that input from those experts, refine the framework, did that through repeated cycles, and have come up with what we're presenting you today. So we propose this following definition of what it means to deliver the objective, which is a decarbonized power system. So there's a lot to take in, and that's because there is a lot that needs to be done. There is 28 segments here on the page that's grouped across two main sections. On the outer ring, you see the enablers that enable the delivery of infrastructure, and within the inner ring, there is the segments of infrastructure that need to be delivered for a decarbonized power system. You can almost think of these as two axes. If we zoom out a little bit, there's actually really four main things that are going on. Within infrastructure, there's three key sections: generation and networks, grid scale flexibility, and end user demand. And reforming these and delivering the infrastructure needed across them is underpinned by the enablers that support the delivery of infrastructure that's sitting above that. Having defined the objective, we've used the landscape to then assess progress across each of these segments. Again, there's a lot on the page, and I don't expect you to read all of it. Two rules of thumb: green is good, you want to keep delivering at this pace. Red means we have to pay attention. Delivery is not happening at the pace we need, and there isn't yet a focused effort to improve the picture. So these are the areas that present the biggest opportunities for policy to accelerate progress. We are going to highlight 6 segments that require the most attention in the upcoming slide, but before that, you'll see a lot of yellow in this picture, which is obviously a lot better than red and amber, but these are still areas that are slow. And the reason why they're slow is to do a lot with the picture on the right-hand side, which is the enablers. And we think a lot of this is being held back by some of the key bottlenecks that are presenting themselves in the policy space. And we'll come on to how we might be able to address them. So I've kind of highlighted the 6 areas that we'll be covering in a little more detail today. But for completeness, on the infrastructure side, it's distribution and energy efficiency. And on the enabler side, there's strategy and coordination, public engagement and advocacy, workforce and supply chains, and financing and investment. It should be noted that this picture's actually moved quite a lot over the past year or so that we've been doing this study. For example, connections and planning or permitting were 2 areas that were highlighted early on in the study as being areas that need urgent reform. But you'll notice that we haven't highlighted those for the sake of this presentation, and that's because a lot of reform is taking place in those areas, and we think it's getting a lot of policy attention already trying to address those bottlenecks. So it'd be great to take you through the 10 key recommendations, and the first one of those is across energy efficiency within infrastructure. And this is probably one of the areas where we didn't get a chance to deep dive as much, and we focused on the domestic energy consumption side. And here, there's been a very commonly held recommendation that we're repeating, which is we need to be launching a nationally coordinated energy efficiency and home retrofit program without delay. That's going to be a key enabler of reducing the demand for energy and allowing us to decarbonize the electrons that we've got on the grid. And this is an area of policy where the UK has been quite inconsistent, and there's a lot that can be done across both domestic and industry. Second and third recommendations sit across strategy, coordination, and governance. At the moment, there is no overarching plan for how we deliver this, and there's no one owning delivery. And usually no ownership means no accountability, which means no results. So the second recommendation is for the Future System Operator, now the NESO, and for the Department of Energy and Net Zero or another capable organization to publish a plan for how we can deliver a resilient and decarbonized power system. And the third recommendation is for the government to appoint or create a minister-led infrastructure delivery body with responsibility to then deliver that plan. Our fourth, fifth, and sixth recommendations sit across public engagement and advocacy. This is one of the areas that we were quite surprised to find was likely to be a bottleneck, but policy has to bring the public along and help all of us make advocates for this change. This is going to be the single largest infrastructure delivery program the UK has ever undertaken. It's roughly delivering 10 HS2 projects in 12 years, and we need an updated social contract to deliver that. It's going to touch every one of us. So recommendation 4 is around involving the public in that decision-making required on making those key trade-offs. Recommendation 5 is around rapidly publishing a public communication strategy and plan with the aim of establishing that broad base of support for the overarching goal of net zero, and in particular for the power system decarbonization that's required in the interim. And finally, some work has already gone into disrupting communities and compensating them for specifically the grid part of this infrastructure, but there's a lot of other infrastructure that's going to be built. So we need to rapidly conclude and implement a generous community compensation scheme for those that will be bearing the majority of the burden of hosting this critical power system infrastructure. Moving on to our 7th and 8th recommendations that sit across financing and investment. There's an enormous investment that needs to go in, and there's not really yet a plan for how this will be raised. We're no longer in a benign interest rate environment, and there's significant global competition for investment. So the 7th recommendation here is for the government to rapidly publish a plan for how the UK can increase levels of investment in power system decarbonisation infrastructure. This is going to need to be roughly 2 to 3 times what was achieved in the last 12-year period. So we're talking about a rapid inflection point in the quantum of investment that needs to come into the space. And the 8th recommendation is specifically aimed at the CFD auction scheme, and for the government to reconsider their approach to this and to incorporate a number of non-price factors to ensure that they're effective as tools for price discovery. Finally, moving on to our 2 last key recommendations. This is around workforce and supply chains. There's been a lot of good work that's happened across the workforce part of this, but it feels like we're a little stuck on the implementation side. And there's a number of recommendations here around the government acting as an enabler for devolved administrations, local authorities, businesses, trade bodies, accrediting organizations, etc., to come together and to create a comprehensive net zero workforce action plan by the end of 2024. This has been something that's in the in-tray for a while, and it would be great for it to come out and be published. And finally, again, there's been a lot of work that's done on critical minerals, but supply chains goes well beyond that. And there needs to be a centrally coordinated plan, again, to publish a comprehensive analysis of those supply chain requirements that is critical to the net zero transition, and again, the interim target of the power system decarbonisation. And again, this is an area where, for example, recent reports on the grid or offshore wind have come up with supply chain plans, but there needs to be some overarching view of how all these things will fit together and what needs to be done to make sure we have those supply chains that are scaled to deliver this. A couple of brief conclusions to leave you with. So we've shown you the framework that we think helps define what it means to deliver a decarbonised power system and an initial assessment of where the UK stands. There is ample opportunity to accelerate delivery of the infrastructure needed to deliver that decarbonised power system by 2035. However, that needs to come with a concerted effort across a number of key enablers to unlock that delivery. Final note to say thank you. You can scan the QR code on the screen to download the full report and access both the recommendations we discussed today, but also the broader assessment and a longer list that sits across the entire landscape. And over to Aidan to introduce our panel.
Great, thank you, Ali. I'm very pleased now to introduce our three panelists who will share some remarks on the paper. And as I mentioned earlier, please submit questions for the panelists and for Ali in the Q&A box in the top of the screen, and we will endeavour to answer them over the next half an hour. So our first panellist is Professor Robert Gross. He is the Director of UK Energy Research Centre, as well as Professor in Energy Technology and Policy at Imperial College London. He's extensive teaching experience. He's a fellow and council member of the Energy Institute. He's a council member and former chair of the British Institute of Energy Economics. And he's also currently a member of the Academic Advisory Panel for Ofgem. So he's had experience and engagements in UK policy making and has published extensively on energy policy, economics and technological innovation. So James Spooner, our second panellist, he's the head of M&A at Corky and the co-founder of Energy Transition Corporate Finance Boutique RSF Capital Partners, for which Corky acquired its renewable business in 2023. He started his career with a 10-year tenure at Goldman Sachs, having graduated from Oxford University with an MSc in mathematics. And our third panellist is Dr. Nina Skorupska, CBE. She's a chief executive at REA. Prior to joining the REA, she worked for 20 years for the RWE Group and its UK predecessors across fuel engineering and R&D, power systems of operation and training. She's a board member of Transport for London, the REAL, which is an REA subsidiary, and most recently the Royal BAM Group NV. She also advises Carbon Trust, National Grid, ESO, and the Energy Research Accelerator. She's also a fellow of the Energy Institute, and she received her CBE in 2016 for her services to the renewable energy sector and promoting diversity in the energy industry. So three excellent panelists for you, and I'd like to hand over to Rob to give his initial reactions.
Thanks, Aidan, and I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to comment on this paper. Excellent report, so well done. I feel a bit as if though, whilst I'm at UKirk, and UKirk is distinct from Imperial and is a much wider consortium, I feel a bit like I'm from the home team because I used to hang out with Aidan in the Energy Futures Lab for some years. So I'll be quite brief and hand over to the other colleagues. A few thoughts. So first of all, just around public engagement, which I agree, I think very much comes through. UKirk is an interdisciplinary consortium. We do a lot of social science engagement. We have the Public Engagement Observatory, if you want to find out more about how that looks at how you engage with publics. The problem is important, and it's almost too late because we are in the delivery phase. And so we're crashing into these public engagement problems that we ought to have been anticipating over the last 10 years and building that kind of societal consensus that you were referring to, which is quite difficult. It takes time, doesn't have a simple solution to it. And whilst I agree that compensation of communities is part of the package of measures that are needed, how and who to compensate is a very thorny issue. Nick Windsor's report, the Electricity Commissioner's report, suggested doing that, and of course was greeted by some of the opponents of network infrastructure as just a bribe. So that's a tricky one. I'm glad you highlighted grid scale flex. I'm interested that it's good that the government has a long duration energy storage consultation out. The thing is, grid scale flex takes many forms, offers many different system services, comes at a range of shapes and scales and sizes. And in particular, I think beyond big, there is extremely large long duration energy storage that might be able to deliver into seasonal storage to kind of, if you like, there's a mismatch between renewables output and demand, and that's particularly tricky, which brings me to my next observation. This is not really in the focus of your report, but it's hugely important in the policy context. Whilst we want to decarbonise the power sector, we need gas until we don't. And quite a bit comes with that, because providing these alternative sources, these zero carbon sources of flexibility, will take time. And it's extremely important that not just that the availability of gas-fired power stations, but the infrastructure to deliver gas to them is given appropriate consideration by government in order to maintain security of supply. So UKirk again has quite a long tradition of thinking about how you manage the legacy assets as well as the emerging assets in the energy transition. energy efficiency, I think there seems to me to be a growing consensus that we need a new agency, or we need like an energy savings trust with many more powers and a much bigger budget, because there's multiple multiple information failures and need for training and certification and other things. We also need to be getting heat pumps away in those properties that don't need extensive fabric renovation, and there's actually millions of those properties in the country. Going for fabric first will hold us up. That's probably an aside for today. And so finally, I think, you know, one of the things which is a major preoccupation for me personally, it's not like a UKIRK view per se, and it's much more of an opinion. If we want to electrify the 2/3 of energy services that we currently provide energy services by burning stuff directly, so we burn gas in homes and we burn petroleum products in our vehicles. And if we want to electrify those 2/3 of final energy consumption, we need to have a really strong strategic focus on the fact that electricity needs to be not just zero carbon, but also cheap, affordable, and not just at certain times of the day, but on average and across all of the times that people might be needing it. We do have an opportunity to deliver that because we've got this fantastic wind resource, for example. But when you refer to it as 10 HS2 projects, I think that really gives a sense of the scale of this infrastructure challenge. I think there's an awful lot that we have the potential to get wrong in the delivery. And your points around finance are also particularly well made, I think, because not only do we need to have a strong focus on delivering, we also need to have a strong focus on continuing to ensure that the investment environment is as attractive as possible, in order to, whilst interest rates have gone up, we don't want any larger a risk premium on those interest rates than we absolutely have to have, because for these very capital intensive assets, the cost of energy to consumers is very significantly a function of the cost of capital. And the cost of capital, apart from the more immature projects where there's technology risk, is very much a product of the regulatory risk and the market context, which is a product of policy. And so in all of these debates we're having at the moment about review of electricity markets and all of those things, I think that delivery challenge should be the primary goal, because it's such a huge challenge. That's it from me.
Many thanks, Rob. Let's move on to James.
Great, thanks very much, Aidan, and yeah, very pleased to be here today, and thank you for Ali for the great presentation, and congratulations on the paper. I've actually been involved in this paper since the very beginning, actually. So maybe if you'll allow, I'll give a bit of background to how we got here, because it is I think quite interesting. And so when we started this paper, and so, you know, our objectives here at Corkia, we're an investor and a partner of local development teams for renewable energy assets. So we're kind of investing and partnering with the people on the ground, trying to develop the solar, wind, battery assets to deliver at least the generation piece of this journey. So we're really interested to understand, okay, you know, how, you know, what are the barriers for us to getting to this 2035 target, in particular here in the UK, where, you know, which is a key market for us. And I think what we envisaged is us, you know, identifying a couple of issues that were the main problems and then delving really deep into those. And I guess on the ground, it's no surprise to see that the things that we're worried about are the topical things around grid connections, planning, and planning reforms. And so I think that's what we initially envisaged. But then through the early stage research work, we really uncovered that there is no good framework in place for describing how we get from where we are today to the 2035 target. And that in itself is a big, was a big piece of work. And so producing this taxonomy and the way it's been, graphically represented by Ali, I think was the work in itself. And I think that says something, that this is a very complicated issue. The energy transition as a whole, it's a huge undertaking. It's one of the biggest transitions. We can compare it to other major transitions that have happened in the past. And, we had some discussions with Aidan on that from his other work in Imperial. And so, the fact that the report is focused on that overall framework, I think is really interesting, and was how we got to this and ended up in this space. Then, when it comes to the actual conclusions from the report in terms of the recommendations, maybe a couple of things, to pick up from our side as, I guess, a private capital or private, investor in the space, and one who's doing development and things. Obviously, to pick up what Ali said, it is grid connections that are the main topic and the main focus for everyone at the moment. and so, but I think, we leave that to one side as a topic that's, very well documented and things at the moment. For me, the biggest conclusion and the slightly scary thing is the public engagement. So I would reiterate what Rob said, is that it's really scary when you look into how little has been done here, and how how this massive energy transition, which is, very necessary, very exciting, how that's really ends up with the consumers. The message in the delivery is really not reflected of the the undertaking, and I think we need to trust the electorate a little bit more in understanding the wider picture, and how we're going to get there. And so I think that's really good that that's raised here, and obviously that then feeds into how we how we change policy and everything towards it. The other topic that, no surprise, I'll want to comment on is finance and investment. So often, it's easy to say that, look, there is a lot of money out there that wants to invest in green technologies or in ESG. Yes, but the amount of financing we need here is enormous, and it's much bigger than the financing that's even available today. And so again, to reiterate what Rob said, it's massively important that through policy and through and also through investor confidence, with the certainty of what the policy and the governments and what we're saying in terms of politics leads to the most amount of investments at the cheapest cost possible rates. And so here, when we think about some of the recommendations in regards to CFDs, and also in regards to having clear policies that give investors the confidence that they should be invested in the UK's energy transition, these are investors who have the choice to invest across multiple different markets and countries. If they're going to choose the UK, they want to see a clear path, a rigid system, accountability, and not maybe some of the uncertainty that we've had over the last couple of years in particular, or exactly through the period of this research. So that was the other thing that was fascinating, and maybe very painful for Ali, was doing the research and then new pieces of work and new topics coming up almost on a weekly basis at one point. The final thing I'd just like to mention is the other interesting side of this report from our standpoint here at Corkia. We're doing renewable energy development in 8 different markets, and so what's very interesting here is how the UK compares to other markets. And it would be amazing to think we could run a framework like this in every one of our markets and compare how everyone's doing across these metrics. Sadly, that was outside of the scope of this report, but that would have been nice. But it is interesting to see that everyone is going through the same issues. The energy transition is a global is global, and every country's got slightly different dynamics. And it's worth saying the UK is unique. It is a very interesting and good case study for this decarbonisation of the electricity system, because of the ambitious targets we have, because of the renewable energy resources we have, in particular with offshore wind, but now supported with solar and batteries, because of our because of the financing capabilities we have here, because of our history and infrastructure and things. So it is a really interesting case study for the UK, and many other countries are looking at the UK as a market leader still, with things like the CFD, with our adoption of batteries. And so it would be great to think that we can lead the way in terms of policy and continue that, but maybe that's not it's not quite the reality today. Anyway, enough from me, and I look forward to the questions, and over to Nina.
Hi, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to comment. And well done and congratulations on this report. And picking up very quickly before I explain who the REA is and why this report is relevant to me personally as a chief executive. There are clear studies out there comparing UK's leadership, and if my raised eyebrows that you can't see behind my glasses is indicating that we're not exactly leaders in all of this. There are comparisons of markets and views of investors and developers, because as James quite rightly said, people will vote with their money and their resources to a nation that has really got its act together. And this landscape that we're all operating in energy is complicated and complex. And your infographic of almost what I call a radar diagram kind of gives a view in a snapshot of where the difficult heavy lifting areas are to have to deal with. And then people can make choices on where they go forward. Anyway, a little bit about the REA. we've been at this, trying to create this landscape for renewable developers, predominantly for all the different forms of renewable and clean technology that you find on land, rather than offshore, which is our colleagues in Renewable UK. So everything from power, heat, transport and circular resources, our members are all over all of those different areas like Arash, from large scale solar farms and sustainable biomass power plants that have converted our coal plants to be burning biomass these days, through to in people's homes. And then now, how many have we got? 15.34 gigawatts of solar that's deployed, with a large tranche of that, the massive growth area, because of planning and regulation. Most of the growth has been happening actually on small roofs because of the energy crisis and people wanting to immunize themselves from the energy prices that we've seen. So all of that little story I've just shared just shows the complexity and what drives the change. And if we look at it from politics, as you've summarised, we've had a government over the last 10 years that's blown hot and cold in terms of providing that clear policy and certainty around regulation. And it all came to a massive peak, I think, when we were hosting COP26, where there was a massive dash to finally try and align and make the commitments and show that leadership. But then over the last couple of years, it's gone up and down a bit. But the topic you brought about is where are we in having to accelerate to deliver 2035? Well, we're in 2024 and there's a lot to do. So I would agree with you where the areas are of where we need to accelerate. But I also wanted to really highlight the importance of the role of regional and local delivery now, because historically, and in the world I used to live when I when I ran coal, oil and gas fired power stations, the latter one being near Oxford, everything was about the grid. But now, and with the consumer engagement, or should I say the encouragement of more prosumer engagement, where people are vested in their energy, if we can help them afford to do it with all the policies that we bring to bear, then we will see the increasing service provision to our energy security and deliver net zero from a bottom-up approach. The people we work with also are all about decarbonising heat. As you see my little banner behind us, we have a whole load of members in heat pumps and other areas that want to deliver, and also in transport and delivering the EV charging infrastructure. I think when we can look at your radar diagram and find out which are the ones that if we put so much effort that would accelerate deployment across a whole number of different areas, that will give us the chance, the real chance to really meet that 2035 target. I want to come back to what Rob said about legacy assets. You know, I worked on a coal-fired power station and closed it. I worked on an oil-fired power station and we closed it. And gas, and the lament of the fact that we do need fossil gas for a long time. How do we ensure that that transition happens? And to be particularly provocative, I'm very worried about that debate around a just transition being weaponized now as a reason to do nothing, because people are too worried, because we have not got our act together to really show how that skills transition can really happen. Every single person I worked on all of those legacy power stations went on to fantastic jobs. It's about a will and a consistency, and not chopping and changing and creating more and more quangos of task force, reinventing the landscape that we want to see. So I really applaud this review, and we're happy to work with you on that and talk maybe with James around the fact that we have to hold our government to account by comparing and contrasting how fast and how slow that we are going on this transition. And at the moment, we give it a 6 out of 10 from our scorecard of the Energy Transition Readiness Index. But I think there's so much to go at here that UK could quickly re-establish itself as a leader if we do get that policy and regulatory landscape really singing and pointing in the right direction. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you to all of our panelists for that introduction and those interesting and challenging remarks. So we're now going to go to some questions. We already have some questions published on the Q&A box, but if you want to ask the panel or Ali any questions, please do put the question in the box and we will get around. So our first question is from Ron Loveland, who says, Rob, great commentary with strong messages on the interim role of gas and the importance of electricity affordability. Do you think the NESO will be independent enough, however, to provide realistic strategic planning solutions not distorted by political ideologies? So that's for Rob, but also anyone else on the panel who'd like to come in on
that. I'm sure other panel members will have views, and so I think it's actually a bit too early to say exactly how powerful or what the relationship, because I think that the governance arrangements and relationships between NESO, Ofgem, and the department need some clarification, and I think that the extent to which NESO is truly vested with the kind of independence that Ron refers to remains to be seen. I think that there is a political dimension to any of these choices, because there'll be regional implications, if nothing else, of having a strategic spatial energy plan that will have implications for Wales, where I know Ron advises the Welsh government, and Scotland and other parts of GB. The island of Ireland has different arrangements, so it's important to be clear that's a GB question. I hope so will be the answer. It ought to. It needs to be sufficiently empowered, but without a democratic deficit. So it's making recommendations. Ultimately, government will need to make decisions about politically contested pieces of infrastructure and about everything else. I would just qualify what I said about gas. My point is not so much that I'm trying to make an apology for carrying on burning gas indefinitely, but rather that if we're going to have security of supply, and in particular if we're going to be able to meet those wind droughts during the winter, those peak demand periods, before and until we've got the flexibility, low carbon flexibility in place, then we're going to need to have a fleet of gas-fired power stations that we use a lot less. And if we use them a lot less, their economics changes and how we pay for them changes. And the same is true of the gas transmission infrastructure. Yeah. So that's the challenge. Totally. Anyway.
I can make some comments about the ESO. As I mentioned, as was described before, for the last 4 years, I've been on the industry advisory panel of National Grid ESO, and how they were justifying their business plan in their relationship to Ofgem, and then the debate about the fact that the ESO had to be pulled out of a public body, publicly owned organisation like National Grid, with the establishment in this energy bill back in October to create the future system operator and now the national energy system operator. In all of those plans, there was a worry, as you say, Rob, about how independent will they be. But I believe Ofgem and the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero recently published their overarching guidance of governance now, and about that independence and the different roles of what Ofgem will do and what will the government body do. But again, as we have to wait and see, and fingers crossed. My concern is that it's established this year and we get going with it rather than arguing around the I's being dotted and the T's being crossed, because we can't wait. You know, overused phrase of perfect being the enemy of the good. We need to be getting it moving and getting it to make those decisions across all the regional system planners, the energy strategic planners, this body, that the distributed network operators are all waiting to come into play. And then how does it interact with the major regional transport bodies as well? Because there's more to it than just, you know, old ESO structure to resolve. So fingers crossed they will act in that way, and we have to hold them accountable to do it.
Brilliant, thank you. So our next question is from Phil Heptonstall. This is probably for Nina and James, actually, because they'll be the ones who will be delivering it. So flexibility was mentioned. How are we going to get to these hugely increased levels of flexible electricity generation that we're going to need over the next 10 to 20 years? What are the what do we actually need to get that done?
I have a view, a very strong view. I think we need to create the right routes to markets to incentivize the different flexibility assets. We didn't start off that well by defining energy storage as a generation asset. This is going way, way back. It needs to be its own class, and therefore we could have defined how to fund and invest in it, but it's kind of like hobnailed now to being classed as generation. That's just one small little personal peeve around all the time we've been working on energy storage. But as was mentioned before by Rob, flexibility has to be defined over the different time frames, but it is about rewarding the asset to do the right thing at the right time, and so markets are critical. Now we've seen in Norway and other parts of Europe who've already introduced flexibility markets, not as a pilot or a demonstrator, they're actually living and breathing it now, and it's allowing different asset classes to play into it. Even EV charging infrastructure bodies are playing into it in the likes of Norway and Denmark. So we need to see that accelerated route to market and to get some very clear definitions. And the UK, the taxonomy, you know, that Ali's introduced goes a large way to help understand what do we mean by the different timeframes. But there's a consultation papers out at the moment, as we're aware, or the people on the panel are aware, that are defining that. Anyway, James, you carry on, please, about how would you know where to invest in all of this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question about flexibility assets and batteries in the UK and how that's played out over the last couple of years. And so if you do go back, 2, 3, 4 years, the UK was a leader in, and hopefully still is a leader, but yeah, definitely was a leader in terms of the business case for flexibility assets, strong ancillary services, revenue stream, and that did lead to, and has led to lots of investment in batteries in the UK, and the UK being top of, attractiveness indices like the REA does and others do, more broadly, but in particular with batteries. And so UK had a head start here, and many good things to talk about batteries. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, which everyone knows, is lots of investment in batteries on the ground, lots of development, gigawatts and gigawatts of planning applications of batteries in the system. But now we are, there is a bit of a point now where things need to change in terms of how these assets are treated. Nina mentioned everyone very frustrated with how the grid treats batteries, and that is changing, but it's changed very slowly. And now we need, there needs to be much more certainty around, how batteries are treated, the revenue stacks, in order to build these. You mentioned that, Phil, you mentioned the time scale here. You need to build long-term business cases, not business cases that are purely relying on a couple of years of, volatile energy prices, around a war in Europe, right? Which is what we saw, driving a lot of a lot of the high returns we've had for batteries in the last couple of years. So still, I think UK is one of the most attractive markets for batteries. Still lots of investments happening here, but other countries are catching up much faster than we are moving. And they're definitely looking at what the UK's done right and done wrong. And here at Corkia, actually, we're primarily, most of our portfolio is in solar and wind development, but we are doing standalone batteries. But it's a little bit easier right now from a development standpoint to do that in markets that are starting from more of a blank sheet of paper, because they're designing their system, around batteries better. And the need for them is better, and you don't have this lots of competition on the ground in terms of the projects. But so the UK is at a different point in its cycle when it comes to flexibility assets, which is a good thing. We're more advanced, but yeah, lots to do in this, and there's lots happening at the moment. And but the feedback I hear from my colleagues who are more focused on explicitly investing in flexibility assets and operating these assets is maybe that they've been promised things that are not quite being delivered on the timescale that was expected. So, but I'm maybe optimistic a little bit on this topic. Probably the thing that's most uncertain, I think, on the flexibility side is this long duration storage. Right there's a real technology issue where we don't have actually a solution for long duration storage, and in particular for the UK, where a lot of the resource is coming from offshore wind, which has seasonality. There is a number of potential options there, and that's something where capital is not necessarily available for those technologies, to boost them, and that is where kind of support schemes and grant funding and things going into that climate tech would be incredibly valuable. And in terms of bang for your buck, if someone can solve that issue, it would have huge ramifications for the acceleration of the plan.
Brilliant, thanks a lot. So here's a question from Arthur Bessis, who asks, and this could be for the panel. I think Rob has probably some questions and answers on this, but also Nina and James as well. What strong decisions need to be made by government, and including government policy, to reach the 600,000 a year heat pumps? What do we need to make that happen? So yeah, Rob, do you want to start?
I'm happy to. I mean, so one of the things that as a piece of social science research that I have been involved with recently makes very clear is that from a householder perspective, one of the things that people like least is the sense that the government hasn't actually made its mind up about what it thinks the future of decarbonised heating provision should be. And we saw the rejection of the hydrogen town trials because of public opposition to those. Whether you think that hydrogen for heating makes sense or not, or whether you think those objections were well founded or not, is kind of a bit irrelevant. I think that what really matters is that, with the exception of the obvious lead market enthusiasts who are installing heat pumps, many households would like to have a much greater clarity of strategic purpose from the government. So that's because they don't want to be backing the kind of Betamax technology, only to find that the government's changed its mind. So I think we need that clarity of purpose as a first step. We need to focus on those properties for which it is possible to install a heat pump without very extensive building fabric retrofit as a second step. And rather boringly, Aidan, I'll refer you to the Heat Decarbonisation What Works report from UKA from a few years ago that looks at the experience from a whole bunch of countries that have been much further advanced with a heat system transition than the UK is. And there's a package of policies, and it includes capital grants, which we do have. It includes certification and training, which we don't have enough of, quality assurance. And ultimately, many countries move from that kind of incentive, so the carrots, to a stick, where there might be a downstream carbon tax or something that makes the more polluting alternatives less attractive. I have to say that's been more common in countries that use a lot of heating oil than in our instance. And we do have a particular challenge because along with the Netherlands, we are the most gas reliant nation for our heating in the world. I'll pass on to the others now. Thanks.
Brilliant. Nina or James, would you like to come in? Nina, yeah.
Thanks for that, Robert, and I agree with all of those aspects around people's preferences. I joined the board of a major construction and engineering company who build houses because I see the fabric aspects, which leads back to the infrastructure as being the next big challenge, putting agriculture and food production to one side about net zero, but the fabric of our buildings. And we can easily sit back and once we've highlighted the fact that we've got the worst housing stock in Europe in terms of energy efficiency, and we bemoan the fact over and over again, what the hell are we going to do about it? And Rob mentioned that along with the UK, the Netherlands is the gassiest reliant nation. I've seen amazing things done there, and it usually starts with demonstrating on social housing and the investment that people want. But coming back to what do people want? Well, a capital grant, if you can't afford to cover the whole cost of the appliance, like a heat pump, having a chunk of it covered makes no difference. You just can't afford it, so it's not going to happen. Whereas other nations have gone ahead and covered the full cost and helped the person have it installed. Then there's the disruption aspect of not understanding what it could look like and how it can impact. So there's been some fantastic examples where for a whole terraced street of houses, they've been disrupted by a minimum of 2 weeks. And that means cladding on the outside, solar on the roofs, air circulation in the buildings, and a heat pump craned into the back garden. And the whole neighbourhood's done in 2 weeks. And they deliver what they said on the tin. We have so many false starts here in the UK that, in fact, I would point over to the example of Exeter Council and that Essex County Council. They innovatively are following a similar model of minimum disruption and going in and transforming, allowing people who now live in those warm, affordable to live homes as the best advocates of the reason to change. And then you see that curtain twitching moment when you look across the road and people gossip, and then the pull starts to happen, and it then doesn't become the aspect of the people who can afford to do it at the beginning, which is what we've experienced in the UK. And now we're going to hit the majority of people that need to be doing that change. So there's so many different areas to work on there, but there's heat networks as well. It's not just about heat pumps, and there's so much we have to do before maybe we even consider in the future that hydrogen will be a home heat solution. I think net zero hydrogen needs to initially be an industrial decarbonising heat solution first, and that's where the confusion comes, because we're trying to say hydrogen will do it all. It will play a massive role, but when and over what timescales, and the cost it's costing us by not getting that clarity.
Great, thanks a lot, Nina. I'm just going to, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to move to this next question. So this is from Anonymous, so we don't know their name, but they say, thank you for a great discussion. And regarding the continued operation of gas plants, given that they're mostly CCGTs, how are they going to adapt to having to play more of a peaking role in the system, or at least very intermittently a generation role once we've got a lot more renewables? And how will these much lower capacity factors affect prices, and in return, what should be done about that? So this is for the whole panel, really. Does anyone like to come in? Seems like it might be a question for you, maybe Rob or James. Let's ask James.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I was actually going to say, given Nina's background, she definitely better qualified than me to talk about the migrating those assets. But look, I would just reiterate that yeah, it's a good point to raise on the need for these peaking assets in the system going forward. And I think the messaging around the need for that is really important. There's a few slightly nasty headlines you could make in terms of, okay, we're not, do we need gas and gas alongside the things? And I think actually, making it clear that we need these assets alongside. I also think, though, that certainly if you link it to the flexibility angle, I think there's definitely a feeling at the moment that there's, we could be using those battery assets a lot better. And there's currently a bit of a preferential, it's easier to use the gas, the gas generating assets. And that, if there was just, people, if we just worked out how we can use those batteries more efficiently, then we could move a lot of that. But still, the point remains. But actually, I won't. I didn't comment too much on the technical side of things with Nina here. So Nina.
Well, I mean, when we were phasing out oil, if anybody can remember that far back, and Ali looks a bit young to remember all that, and you do too, James. Sorry, Aidan and Rob, I didn't mean to cast aspersions around ageism, but Littlebrook Power Station, which was right near the QE2 bridge, I was the production manager for that, and it never ran except for maybe 5%. And we tried to secure contracts with National Grid, the control room, but they wouldn't do it. But we do have in the UK the capacity market. That's what was established in early days to try and encourage the continuing build of CCGTs back in the noughties. But it never really quite worked. Obviously, colleagues in my old organisation are really looking at carbon capture and storage, and seeing how that can be linked up with broader decarbonising of industrial hubs, and also a lot of research into utilising and switching to hydrogen as well. So there are lots and lots of plans, but as the question has said from Anonymous, it's expensive. You're going to have to pay for that service. And the point about energy security is how much will the NESO judge we will need as backup as we take longer to bring on board what has to happen. Because remember, 2035 says net zero power production. It doesn't say low carbon, we're nearly there yet. It says net zero, as does the Labour plans for 2030. And obviously with the delay of, the various nuclear power plants and the decisions around that, you can see that there needs to be an answer for the continued use of the CCGTs in as lower carbon format as possible. So I haven't got the answers of what the prices are, but we know that carbon prices have to go up in order to send the right market signals to drive the requirement to capture the CO2 and to store it or use it in an appropriate way. So there was a little bit of a rambling answer, but Littlebrook ended up being a film location for who was it? My guys. I had about 60 guys left working on the power plant, and we had the Spice Girls come in and film I'll tell you what you want, what you really want on the top floor, because that's how we made extra money and selling demin water. It's amazing how innovative and creative you can become about those different sites. But more seriously, we will need dispatchable and secure power. So to suddenly say we'll switch off CCGTs, as we said, for coal in 2024, we need to push it as far ahead. But the pressure for it to become more decarbonised and come up with those solutions has to be put on further. That's my personal opinion.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to finish off, Rob, have you got any comments on this?
It's quite a complex topic, and I think we're a bit out of time. I mean, certainly we are already seeing. I think there's one CCGT which will be able to be switched over to hydrogen. So there's a number of different questions to unpack from Anonymous's question. One of which is how you keep the much older legacy assets serviceable and used at very low load factors. They might not just be CCGTs. There's a lot of smaller generation units as well. And there's experience of doing that, and Nina pointed to the example of Littlebrook. We've had the recent payments that were made to the coal stations to keep them going. So I think we need to be careful and not just to assume that it's going to be prohibitively expensive to keep old plant available for use at very low load factor. I don't think that's the case. I think what is interesting and challenging and requires strategic choices is what we're doing around CCS power and hydrogen. However, time is no longer with us.
Yes,
Stop.
unfortunately, we have now reached the end of this presentation. It is 2 p.m. So all that remains to me is to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Ali for authoring the paper, and thanks to everyone who's turned up. This will be available on YouTube, so please share it with your colleagues who couldn't make the session, and please go and download the paper. You will have a link which will be sent to you to the email address you signed up for. So thank you very much for coming, and goodbye.
Thank you and well done,
Thanks,
Ali.
Evan.
Thank you.
Yeah.